Well, good evening everyone, and can I welcome you to the House of Lords and to this talk which we are delighted to hold to celebrate the life of an extraordinary woman, Margaret Haig Thomas, the Viscountess Rhondda. Now, I'm Anita Gale and I'm a member of the Work of Arts Committee in the House of Lords. The Work of Arts Committee were delighted to be able to acquire a rare portrait of Lady Rhondda by Alice Burton, and I think we'll be showing it soon. And we were delighted to have this portrait because I know the House of Lords had been looking for some time to get a portrait of Lady Rhondda, and I was pleased that my colleague Jessica Morden, the Member of Parliament for Newport East, told me about this, and we eventually, the Work of Arts Committee, approved the purchase of it, and it's now hanging in the dining room of the House of Lords. So we're very pleased to hold this event in the River Room, and I would like to thank the Lord Speaker for making it available to us. So I'm now delighted to be able to introduce our speaker, Angela V. John. Angela is the Honorary Professor in the Department of History and Welsh History of Aberystwyth University. She's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Learned Society of Wales, and a Vice President and a former Chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. She has published widely on women and gender history in the 19th and early 20th century in Wales and England. So when we acquired the portrait of Viscountess Rhondda in 2011, we were very pleased that Angela agreed to come and give a talk about Viscountess Rhondda's attempt to take her seat in the House of Lords in 1922, which, had she succeeded, would have made her the first woman to sit in the House of Lords. But in fact, we had to wait until 1958 before a woman sat in the House of Lords. So unfortunately, she was unsuccessful, but continued to campaign through it, and as I said earlier, it took until 1958 for the first woman to sit in the House of Lords. Angela's talk was so inspirational that we were anxious for her to come back and tell us more about this extraordinary woman. She's now finished her research and has indeed published a book. And here is the book. It's called Turning the Tide, and it's a great book. I'm about halfway through it at the moment, Angela. Now Christmas is coming, and it only costs £20. I know the publishers are here in the back, but it's a very good read. So I hope you take advantage. You can't buy it here though, unfortunately. We're not allowed to sell books in the House of Lords. But it is in the Parliamentary Bookshop, I believe. Yes, yeah. So Angela has now, as I said, finished her research, and we are delighted that she's agreed to come back and give us a further instalment, particularly as we're in the middle of Parliamentary Week, with the theme this year of Women and Democracy. And there will be an opportunity later for questions at the end of her talk. And we are filming Angela's talk for the Parliamentary YouTube channel, so you will be able to look at it again. So I am now going to ask Angela to come up and give her talk. We're looking forward to it very much. Thank you, Angela.
Take a sip of water first. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed, Baroness Gale of Blaen Rhondda, for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be able to return here to talk about the second Viscountess Rhondda now that my biography's out. And I'm extremely grateful to everybody who's been involved in organising this event. And in particular, I want to thank Melanie Unwin, the Deputy Curator of Works of Art, for her sterling work. And I want to thank Jessica Morden MP as well, and Baroness Gale, who seems an appropriate, an extremely appropriate person to be introducing this evening's talk. And it's great to see all of you here this evening as well. And I'm especially delighted that members of my family are present, including my niece Katie, who's studying history at Cardiff University and whose birthday it is today, as well as friends from London and beyond, from Wales, and even from Germany and California. Well, in 2011, I spoke about Lady Rhondda's protracted struggle to gain a seat for women in the House of Lords. This evening, what I want to do is to cast my net rather more widely. And since this is Parliament Week, and there is a focus on women in democracy, it seems appropriate that I should talk about the various means, often ingenious and certainly prescient, by which Lady Rhondda helped to secure equal rights for women in the first half of the last century. But first, I think I need to point out that we're dealing with a woman of many names. In Wales, she's best remembered as Margaret Haig Thomas, reflecting both of her parents' surnames. Born in London in 1883, but growing up in the rarefied atmosphere of Llanwern Park near Newport, Monmouthshire, Margaret, as I shall call her for consistency, was the only child of Sybil Haig from a highly respectable, old-established family of Scots descent, but settled in Radnorshire, and her more arriviste husband, D.A. Thomas, known as D.A., the immensely wealthy Welsh and international industrialist and Liberal politician. At a progressive girls' boarding school, St Leonard's in Scotland, she was simply called Margaret Thomas. By 1908, she'd become Mrs Mackworth after marrying into the Monmouthshire gentry, and a few years later, she became Lady Mackworth. In 1923, Margaret and Humphrey Mackworth divorced, and then, thanks to her father, 5 years earlier, she'd actually become the second Viscountess Rhondda. So there's a whole number of names, which means it's actually quite difficult at times tracking her. The First World War had seen the making, politically, and the breaking of D.A., her father. He'd belatedly received the recognition he previously lacked by serving as a minister under Lloyd George. He was rewarded with the title of Lord Rhondda, and in 1918, largely due to the pressure of work, and it was he who introduced the nation to food rationing, he died, having just become Lord Rhondda. Having just become Viscount Rhondda. He'd obtained permission from the king by special remainder for his daughter to take his title. His widow became the Dowager Viscountess Rhondda. Then and since, and that's her mother, that's the Dowager Viscountess Rhondda. So then and since, the existence of two Viscountess Rhonddas, and Sybil didn't die until 1941, has of course produced considerable confusion. Margaret, easily the more progressive of the two, kept her title until she died, childless, in 1958. Margaret's life also, as well as having all these different names, her life also straddled Wales and England. And although it appears to be neatly divided into Wales pre-First World War and London and South East England, Kent and then Surrey from the 1920s, even that wasn't so simple. Throughout her childhood, her parents had a flat in London's Victoria, and she attended Notting Hill High School for a while. In the last years of her life, she spent more and more time back in Wales, particularly in Radnorshire, where she'd enjoyed childhood holidays with her extended family. And her ashes are buried in the village where she grew up, Llanwern. To these many names and places, we can add multiple images. Margaret has been labelled in a number of ways. She was a suffragette. She was a survivor of the Lusitania disaster, and that story alone is a piece of high drama. She was a major figure in international business in the 1920s. In fact, one newspaper rather unfortunately dubbed her Britain's biggest businesswoman. She held more directorships than any other woman in the UK after the First World War, and in 1926 she became the first and to date sole female president of the Institute of Directors. She was a highly influential editor and journalist. She's also been seen as an equalitarian feminist. Identifying and sometimes questioning these descriptions of such a protean character has been a challenge. The various facets of Margaret's life suggest the many identities that an individual can hold in tension, and that a biographer needs to tease out but not simplify. Biographical subjects are, like all of us, mightily inconsistent, both over time and even at the same time. Margaret's catholicity of interests sometimes overlapped rather than just existing sequentially. And this evening I want to follow one thread that I believe cuts across her apparently discrete interests. A commitment to equal rights unifies much of Margaret's adult life, though I shall argue that this wasn't quite sustained in the manner that's been presupposed. So let's start with votes for women. June of this year marked the centenary of the dramatic death of the suffragette Emily Wilding Davison at the Derby. That same month was also the centenary of what one Welsh suffragette called Margaret's little bit of arson. It too has been recognised this year. The letterbox that Margaret set alight in Newport was draped in the suffragette colours of purple, white and green, and a short film starring an 8-year-old girl from a Gwent school was released online by a documentary film company to mark the event on the exact day, the 25th of June. And in that summer of 1913, Margaret had travelled to London to obtain her incendiary materials from the suffragette headquarters of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. Sympathetic pharmacists worked with suffragettes in devising combustible concoctions. There was an anxious moment as Margaret travelled home in a crowded third-class compartment on the train, when the woman sitting next to her casually leant her elbow on her flimsily covered baskets containing the chemicals. But she did get back safely, and they were buried in the vegetable garden at her home near Caerleon, under the blackcurrant bushes. Margaret's conversion to suffrage had come just 2.5 weeks after her wedding, which was 5 years earlier. In fact, it was probably what kept her marriage going. She and her husband might have been socially compatible, but their interests diverged greatly. Hunting was his great love. Margaret neatly summed up their outlooks. Humphrey held that no one else should ever read in a room where anyone else wanted to talk. I, brought up in a home in which a father's study was sacred, held on the contrary that no one should ever talk in a room where anyone else wanted to read. But unlike many involved in women's suffrage, Margaret was not rebelling against a narrow Victorian upbringing or reactionary parents. Her father was a forward-looking man in certain respects, and although more sympathetic to constitutional means of support than militant action, he stood by his daughter and was also a vice president of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. Margaret's mother became president of Newport WSPU, and in 1914 she spent her 57th birthday in a London police cell after holding an illegal protest meeting by the statue of Richard the Lionheart, open-air meetings being unlawful within a mile of Westminster. A number of Sybil's relatives went to prison for militant suffrage, including one of her sisters, and it was after her cousin, the Chelsea artist Florence Haig, recuperated at Llanwern from incarceration in Holloway Jail, that Margaret was inspired to attend her first suffrage demonstration in Hyde Park. There was no looking back, and unlike many who graduated from the peaceful suffragists to the suffragettes, Margaret enrolled straight into the militant WSPU. In compelling prose, she described the women's suffrage movement as the very salt of life, claiming that it, quote, gave us release of energy. It gave us that sense of being of some use in the scheme of things, without which no human being can live at peace. It made us feel that we were part of life, not just outside watching it. Setting that letterbox alight, and there it is, in 1913, led to her arrest, imprisonment, and hunger strike. However, whilst the action that Margaret took can be seen as brave, braver than we can perhaps appreciate today within a society that takes our vital voting rights too much for granted, I believe there are problems in focusing unduly on this one action and phase of her life. For a start, Margaret was only one amongst many women who were prepared to take militant action. Indeed, letterboxes and their contents became the preferred target for suffragettes. In the Metropolitan Police District alone, from June 1913 to July 1914, damage was done to more than 500 letterboxes. There were anyway always many more women who opted for passive resistance or put their faith instead in arguments and entirely peaceful persuasion. And of course, Margaret was from a much more privileged as well as supportive background than many. Returning very late at night from meetings in London, she would even be met at Newport railway station by Humphrey, armed with a flask of hot soup. Margaret was imprisoned in Usk Jail after her little bit of arson. And Usk Jail was hardly Holloway, and at a time when the authorities had become alert to the bad publicity that could be garnered from such ill treatment of prisoners. She was not forcibly fed, and she was incarcerated for a considerably shorter period than most suffragettes, a mere 6 days, though that, of course, was a horrendously long time for any individual to endure a hunger strike, and she paid for it. Margaret had also hoped to be returned to prison, having been released under the notorious Cat and Mouse Act that enabled the authorities to let out ailing prisoners in danger of becoming martyrs and rearrest them subsequently without further trial. She insisted that her fine was paid against her will. Humphrey or her parents might have paid, we don't know for sure, though it's also likely that the Home Office, well aware of the high-profile prisoner and anxious to circumvent further trouble, might also have paid. Margaret continued to be secretary of the Newport WSPU. That's their banner. Indeed, she held this position for the whole of its existence, for 5.5 years, though for about 6 months in 1912 she shared the post with Olive Fontaine. It involved commitment and stamina, facing rotten eggs, live mice, herrings, rotten cabbages, hair pulling, and much more at meetings. Speaking in public meetings was an ordeal for young ladies in Edwardian Britain. And Margaret and her Aunt Lottie even took to parading the streets of Newport. It's not a very good picture, but it's from a newspaper, and you can see them. They were advertising meetings with sandwich boards. Margaret wrote about the cause for Welsh newspapers. She provided weekly reports for the British suffrage press as well, and she orchestrated meetings and fundraising activities across the region until the war broke out. This side of suffrage understandably received less attention in her 1933 autobiography, This Was My Life, than the more dramatic exploits. Yet this commitment, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. Women's suffrage was clearly a vital formative experience in Margaret's life story and in British political history. But I think we also need to recognise that she played a key role in the winning of the vote for all women in 1928. And this is something that's received far less attention. Between 1926 and 1928, Margaret was one of the leading figures in the final push to enfranchise those who'd been excluded from the vote in 1918, most notably all women between the ages of 21 and 30. In 1926, she presided over a dinner to welcome back the ageing Mrs. Pankhurst from France, where she'd been running a tea shop. Margaret chaired the committee that organised a mass march and demonstration to Hyde Park in July 1926. This brought together 40 different women's organisations, and it had a few daring modern flourishes. Mrs. Elliot Lynn, for example, flew over the marchers in an aeroplane. Margaret chaired the Equal Political Rights Campaign Committee, and she and Viscountess Astor, the first woman to take a seat in the House of Commons, headed a deputation to the Prime Minister Baldwin the following year, and they orchestrated a series of open-air meetings, poster parades with umbrellas in Theatreland, and the lobbying of MPs. She chaired one of the 3 platforms on the central plinth at a huge Trafalgar Square rally in June. One of the square's lions sported a placard declaring, "Gentlemen prefer blondes, but blondes prefer the vote." Songs included "We Want the Vote," sung to the tune of 3 Blind Mice. And the following spring, the Equal Franchise Bill was finally introduced and was passed in the summer. Margaret also chaired a carefully worded celebration called a Victory and After Luncheon that October at a London hotel. In her speech, she described the vote as merely one concrete symbol of equality and not an end in itself. Having paid tribute to the pioneers of the last 60 years, she posed a vital question. I wonder how many more generations are going to use up their lives before we can put the whole thing behind us and forget that there was ever any difference of status, freedom or opportunity based on the difference in sex. Margaret had held several important posts in women's national service during the First World War, and at its end she'd sat on reconstruction committees focusing on women's employment opportunities. She spoke in favour of the creation of a Ministry of Health with proper representation for women, and she founded the Women's Industrial Council to support equal employment opportunities for working class women. In the 1920s, she also forged links with American feminists, working closely with equal rights lawyer Alice Paul. That's Margaret shaking hands with Alice Paul, the American Alice Paul, and helped to form a British committee of the United States National Women's Party. She was one of the founders of the Open Door Council, and that opposed what it saw as restrictive legislation that limited women's employment opportunities by arguing that they were in need of special protection. Such a perspective differed from those sometimes called new feminists, like Eleanor Rathbone in the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship. Margaret was in what was called the old feminist camp, and she subscribed to the slogan, "Equality First." She was also one of the founders of Equal Rights International, the only organisation to urge that the League of Nations adopt an equal rights treaty. This work grew out of the organisation that Margaret had founded in 1921, the 6-Point Group. Like the Chartists of the 1830s, it too had its 6-point charter. This one made gender equality paramount. It sought to make women's new voting rights effective through what Margaret called a social betterment programme that demanded effective legislation on issues such as child assault, equal pay for teachers, and equal guardianship rights for men and women. Far-sighted in its aims and imaginative in its methods, it was a powerful non-party pressure group. It even devised a way of naming and shaming those MPs whose record was not good by publishing black and white lists before elections. Opponents of women's causes were exposed. Supporters were praised and treated to an annual luncheon. The latter included the Tory Viscountess Astor, the Liberal Margaret Wintringham, Captain Wedgwood Ben and Isaac Foote. They were the goodies. A drab list covered those who had not lived up to their promises. And the young Vera Brittain and Winifred Holtby, both of whom knew Margaret very well, cut their political teeth giving speeches on the 6-point group platform at Hyde Park. And as I discussed in my previous talk here, Margaret was the person responsible for exerting sustained pressure for peeresses in their own right to take their seats in the House of Lords. Arguing that the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919 encompassed this, she almost succeeded in 1922, but a rearguard action by the erudite but somewhat antediluvian Lord Chancellor, the Earl of Birkenhead, put the clock back. For 40 years she played a game of political snakes and ladders with the House of Lords, finding along the way some doughty champions such as Viscount Astor, but also encountering reactionary, wary figures. As late as 1957, the Earl of Glasgow remarked that this is about the only place in the kingdom where men can meet without women. For heaven's sake, let's keep it that way. Only in 1958, just after the death of Margaret, known as the persistent peeress, were the first women announced who would take their seats under the new Life Peerages Act. Not until 1963 could hereditary women peers join them. Only then was Britain permitted to sign up to the United Nations Convention on the Political Rights of Women. Excuse me, another gulp. Now, 50 years later, there is a female presiding officer in the House of Lords, Lord Speaker Baroness de Souza, and Alice Burton's portrait of Lady Rhondda hangs in the Lords' dining room. Acquired for the parliamentary collection and recently carefully restored, it means that Margaret has, in a sense, joined her father in the Palace of Westminster, though his portrait's in the Commons tea room. She's an interesting company amidst former Lord Chancellors, including her bête noire, the Earl of Birkenhead, whose portrait is also in the same room. This portrait of Margaret had once hung in the offices of Time and Tide, the weekly paper that she founded in 1920, edited from 1926, and oversaw until her death in 1958. And it is this paper that provides, I believe, a key to understanding her influence and significance. Margaret declared that publicity is power. Such a statement may not be remarkable today, but it was far-sighted then. She'd learned from the publicity-conscious suffragettes who knew how to attract attention. She recognised the power of advertising. Addressing at Wembley the International Advertising Convention that brought together the leading publicity experts in the English-speaking world, she declared, "We have been pioneers in industry, but in publicity we have been laggards. Markets are never assured. They have to be found or created by publicity campaigns." Margaret's paper brought together her different worlds. It advertised a range of products for the modern woman and man, and it carried advertisements for a number of companies that she was directly associated with, such as the Salutaris Water Company and the British Fire Insurance Company. It also provided details about, for example, Gwaenca Gerwyn Colliery and the Welsh Navigation Steam Coal Company Limited. Bloomsbury at times must have been slightly bemused to read all these accounts of the AGMs of colliery companies. Here's an advert, it's not very easy to read, but it's a Time and Tide advert for Formamint, the germ-killing throat tablet, maybe it'd be of use tonight, the germ-killing throat tablet that was part of the Sanatogen company that Margaret actually owned as well. And the South Wales Printing company would be responsible for printing these adverts. So all her worlds kind of came together. And the slightly bohemian world of the literati didn't usually mix quite so closely in page and person with coal mining and big business, as did Margaret Rhondda. In fact, she made the most of her connections. For example, getting financial support for Oxford women's colleges from Lady Mond, wife of the founder of the largest nickel works in the world, situated in South Wales. Most importantly, her paper provided a platform for advertising the work of organisations like the 6 Point Group, many of the causes and campaigns that she believed in so fervently. Indeed, it was here that the ideas of the 6 Point Group were first explored, then expanded. This outlet gave Margaret far more scope for promoting her causes than most organisations. Having your own paper does have a distinct advantage. From the outset, it was a weekly review with a difference. It had a pioneering all-female board, and remember this is 1920 that it set up. And it became one of the most innovative, imaginative and adaptable weekly papers ever produced in Britain. In its early days, its journalism and high standards gave newly enfranchised women in particular a voice and a confidence. But it was never like the lowbrow women's magazines, seeing itself rather as a paper for the thinking woman and man. And it took a much broader approach than papers advocating causes like votes for women. Time and Tide began life in Fleet Street and it then moved to Bloomsbury. It covered politics, but it was emphatically non-party. It covered literature, sport, drama, and Margaret penned many a theatre review under the pseudonym of Anne Doubleday. And it always included articles with views not shared by the editor. And she wrote hundreds of pieces for it, editorials, features, anonymous diary comments, pseudonymous articles by Candida, as she called herself, literary criticism of the writings of H.G. Wells, and signed think pieces for the popular Notes on the Way column in the 30s, and those columns were actually also turned into a book that she edited. After the full enfranchisement of women in 1928, Time and Tide then morphed into a flagship paper for the arts, showcasing the work of upcoming and leading writers of the day, from Virginia Woolf to D.H. Lawrence. It was one of the first UK periodicals to publish the work of black writers such as the African-American poet County Callan. Margaret's good friend George Bernard Shaw helped to boost its sales. Another close friend, Winifred Holtby, was on its staff, as was, somewhat later, John Betjeman. E.M. Delafield's wonderfully witty Diary of a Provincial Lady, in which Margaret is caricatured, first saw the light of day in serial form in Time and Tide. By the 1940s, the paper had transmuted again, and it was now really largely an international politics journal. In the early days of the Second World War, it was selling a staggering 40,000 copies weekly. And this is at a time when there's all kinds of other forms of competing media. And it was read, of course, by many more. So the cost of producing this high-quality paper week after week was beginning to take a serious toll on Margaret's fortunes, which had already been hit by the Depression. She'd withdrawn from her industrial interests, and her energies were almost entirely devoted to her paper in this period. Having said this, she also had something of a reputation for enjoying the good life. Her parties were legendary, she was known to be generous, and she travelled extensively. But she also worked hard at home and abroad, and her health suffered as a consequence. After the Second World War, her politics shifted, and this daughter of a Liberal minister who'd never forgiven Asquith for not supporting women's suffrage finally became a Tory voter. She had, of course, only gained the vote in 1918 in her mid-30s, when she was slightly left-leaning. Then and later, she refused to join a political party. But the 1930s saw her libertarian streak come to the fore, and she was a vice president of the National Council for Civil Liberties from its inception, or the Council for Civil Liberties as it was originally known. She seems to have been at her most progressive in the mid to late 30s when it came to international politics. It is, I think, no coincidence that she was close to Ellen Wilkinson in these years. From 1941, Margaret lived during the week at Dolphin Square, as did Red Ellen, as Wilkinson was known. Margaret supported Ellen Wilkinson's stance on the Spanish Civil War, and the two women, along with Aneurin Bevan and Edith Summerskill, were delegates at a vast congress in Paris to protest against the bombing of Spanish towns and urge peace. Both women also became fervently anti-appeasement. Having until fairly recently been highly critical of Churchill, Margaret then revised her views, and after the Second World War, he really became the politician she was prepared to support. Wary of the concept of a planned state, she became critical of the domestic policy of Attlee's Labour government. By the time of the 1951 general election, her party's independent non-party tag had been replaced by the words the Independent Weekly, and I think it was far more difficult to actually claim that the paper really was independent in those final years. And where, I think, in all of this, was Margaret's much vaunted commitment to equal rights? What happened to this commitment in her last years? I think it's interesting to note that historical analysis has tended to focus on her earlier life and her feminism. And I think this can in part be attributed to her autobiography. A compelling read, it was published in 1933 when she was in her 50th year. Although she couldn't have known it, of course, she still had another 25 years ahead of her. Most of the spotlight of This Was My World, as it was called, is on the society that came to an end in 1914. And although revealing about what used to be called the spirit of the age, it actually says little about the First World War years as they affected Margaret personally. As for what was undoubtedly the most productive period of her life, the 1920s, they are conspicuous by their absence from her autobiography. Now, 80 years after the publication of this book, it's important, I think, to consider also the neglected views of the older Margaret. And it looks in many ways as though in those later years she simply moved on to a broader agenda after the protracted struggle for the vote. Gradually, the gender balance of contributors to the paper shifted, despite continuity in the form of a small number of women stalwarts, such as Rose Macaulay and Rebecca West. Margaret even told Virginia Woolf in 1938 that, "I go through the paper every week, taking out women's names and references to matters especially concerning women, because if I left them in, it would soon kill the paper." However, she added an important rider, "but it's maddening." She was adopting, I think, a survival strategy, and she was realistic enough to know that she had to reflect on what was wanted, as well as being in a position to influence, directly or indirectly, how people thought on an issue. She was still painfully aware of how vulnerable she was as a female editor and proprietor. She told Woolf that, quote, "No woman who tried to run a weekly review could remain unaware of how much she was an outsider." In October 1937, Monica Wakely of the 6 Point Group, which Margaret had founded and chaired, wrote to Time and Tide, expressing her disappointment that it hadn't given even the briefest mention of the work of the 18th Assembly of the League of Nations on the status of women. Margaret's response, I think, was revealing. She agreed that such an event was important and deserved notice, yet using an excuse that she would have scorned in the early 1920s, she argued that a weekly review did not enjoy the luxury of a daily paper and had to prioritise. Her paper's events of the week had included the arrival of Mussolini in Munich. Margaret stated unequivocally that in the present state of world tension, this had been the most momentous event of the week. History, of course, proved her to be correct. International relations were now recognised as paramount for the paper in the context of insidious threats to liberty within Europe. In 1936, Margaret told Elizabeth Robbins, writer, former suffragette, and erstwhile director of Time and Tide, that the priority was simply, quote, whether Europe explodes before we have got a real grip. If that happened, it would, she feared, spell, quote, the end of feminism and Western civilization for generations to come. Margaret argued that rather than acting as a class apart, women should use the powers they had and the powers that they'd won to work together with men. Although equality of status was still needed, she believed that in the present climate, better results could be obtained if women used the power they possessed to do good in the world and to familiarise the general public with the idea of men and women working side by side, quote, regardless of sex and on equal terms for the general good. Yet in many parts of the world, women had acquired neither power nor influence. And working side by side with equal rights was far from being a common experience for the majority of women workers in particular within Britain. Indeed, Margaret's plans for the emancipated woman had been and remained essentially that of the educated professional woman. During the war, however, there were some echoes of her earlier activities, which were reflected in the paper itself. Back in 1917 to 18, she'd organised women's recruitment for national service. Now she warned that publicity asking women to take subordinate jobs so that men could be set free for something better was outmoded and, quote, far from inspiring. And in 1943, on the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Representation of the People Act that had granted limited women's suffrage in 1918, she commented on her transformative experience of militant suffrage, saying, "That is where I got my training, and I couldn't have wished for better." In this year, women journalists who were barred from the press club formed a women's press club. Margaret was their first president, and she played an active role in it. And as we know, her pressure on the House of Lords was sustained. She remained a public figure to the last. Seriously ill and with a high temperature, a few months before she died in 1958, in her mid-70s, Margaret took part in a BBC television programme about women in the House of Lords. She'd now waged her campaign for 40 years. Her obituary in the Times was headed "Champion of her sex." Women's equality was, I think, hardwired into Margaret Rhondda's thinking, even though it was no longer to the forefront in her later years. Yet she was hardly alone here. In fact, from 1930 onwards, she decided to channel her energies primarily into Time and Tide, arguing that, quote, "If I can make the paper go in a big way, I shall have done as big a thing for feminism as I am capable of." And she succeeded in this. For Margaret, the 1950s were increasingly dominated by failing health and a desperate attempt to keep the paper going against the odds. Finally, the fact that she did so and that it collapsed soon after her death showed both the price that she paid, literally and symbolically, and demonstrated that she had indeed done a big thing for women in democracy by palpably demonstrating in person what a woman in the media could achieve.